the topic that I want to talk about is policy challenges for green economy and sustainable economic development. And those of you who know from the TEEB course, this talk is based on a paper that I wrote recently for the UN Journal Natural Resources Forum, which was kind of an ex post reflection after having done the Global Green New Deal project that Pavan mentioned. The emphasis here is on challenges for sure. And I want to elaborate in this talk on the themes that I touch on this paper. And specifically, what I want to start off with is a little bit about what is a green economy. What do you mean by green economy? And secondly, what progress has been made? Can we sit back from the last few years, which Pavan and I have been involved in at the international level, trying to stimulate some ideas on a green economy and get it into policy-making circles? Have we made progress? Not just us, but has the world made progress on attaining a green economy? I then want to go on and explain that if we are going to continue to make progress, if we're going to be real about the progress, we need to overcome a sustainability challenge, and I'll explain what that is. And the second challenge has to do with funding. Always a dirty word in the international community, but something that really has to be seriously addressed. And then I will make some final remarks. As Pavan mentioned, I'm an economist, so much of what I will talk about comes from an economic perspective, but I hope that you will understand that from my perspective as well, that economics is essential to this whole argument. So what is a green economy? Well, I think a good place to start is with the definition by the UN Environment Program that a green economy is one that results in improved human well-being and social equity while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. And as you'll see in this talk, this definition is key to understanding whether or not we've made progress and what are the challenges ahead. Just to carry on, what this definition means, as UNEP elaborates, is that we want to have an economy that is essentially low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. Now, it doesn't mean that we let go of conventional indicators of economic progress, such as income growth, employment, and poverty alleviation, but such targets and goals should be driven by investments that at the same time reduce carbon emissions and pollution, enhance energy and resource efficiency, and prevent the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So, can we claim progress towards a green economy? Well, in terms of the intellectual debate, and at least in terms of the conceptual thinking on this, I think it's fair enough to say that green growth, the promotion of energy efficiency and clean energy technologies, and sustainable development have been increasingly viewed as complementary goals by the international policymakers. So these items are on the agenda of the global community, particularly policymakers, and even during the height of the global recession, such as the 2010 Seoul Summit of G20 leaders, as this quote shows, the rhetoric is there. Policymakers have been talking about these goals and implementing these goals for some time. Even at the height of the recession, it was argued that green growth is a necessary objective. So the summit leaders said, we recognize that sustainable green growth, as it is inherently a part of sustainable development, is a strategy of quality development, enabling countries to leapfrog old technologies in many sectors, including through the use of energy efficiency and clean technology, and so forth. You can read the rest of it. And that suggests that at the forefront of international policy making is the idea of making progress towards a green economy. Now, it's not just been rhetoric either. I think it's fair to say that one of the unique things about what happened during the Great Recession of 2008 or 9 is that many governments, a handful of governments and possibly a few more, included a sizable green fiscal component in their efforts to boost aggregate demand. And this has never been done before. As part of a deliberate global policy strategy, there has never been an effort to include major environmental investments, particularly in a time of recession and crisis. And the type of green fiscal stimulus falls into three categories. There was, of course, investments in energy efficiency, which included support for energy conservation in buildings, fuel-efficient vehicles, public transport and rail, and improving electric grid transmission. There were investments targeted at low-carbon power, such as support for renewable energy and carbon capture and sequestration. And then finally, there's been general investments in environmental improvement and pollution control, particularly for waste and pollution management and also water improvements. The amount of money was reasonably sizable. Of the $3.3 trillion allocated worldwide for fiscal stimulus over 2008-9, 522 billion was devoted to green expenditures or tax breaks. Almost all of it was by G20 governments, not all G20 governments, but certainly a large number. And this green spending amounts to about 16% of total fiscal stimulus and 0.7% of world GDP, not insignificant. The most of the money of the green stimulus, about 3/5, was, or nearly 2/3, was spent on energy efficiency. If you want to have a breakdown, here are the totals for global spending on green stimulus and the major country contributions. You can see that by far China and the United States spent the largest in terms of absolute amount of the over $500 billion spent on green stimulus. When you look at green stimulus as a share of total fiscal stimulus, in the case of South Korea, almost the entire stimulus package consisted of green measures. It was also large in China and surprisingly large in the European Union, although you have to understand the amount spent by the European Union on total fiscal stimulus was relatively small. The United States, where we received a lot of attention for our green stimulus package, really only 12% of the total fiscal stimulus could be described as green. I think the most interesting statistic is green stimulus as a share of GDP. As I mentioned, the global average was 0.7%, but when you look at some of the Asian countries, particularly South Korea and China, you're talking about quite a sizable hunk of GDP. 5% in the case of South Korea, over 3% in terms of China. Japan, 1%. Australia, 1.3%. The United States, although again absolutely large, it was a small, relatively small share of GDP relative to some Asian countries. So these are rather large commitments. And you know, the big question is, will these policies be successful? Well, there's two ways of looking at the success of these policies. One is, did they actually stimulate aggregate demand in the short run? But I think the more interesting question to me is whether these policies will be judged successful in terms of getting major economies on a transition path to more sustainable development, and particularly the green economy goals as outlined by the UNEP definition I read earlier. HSBC Global Research forecasts that the global market for clean energy and energy efficiency will triple by 2020, and they cite the green stimulus efforts that started during the Great Recession as a major reason for jump-starting these markets, which could be considered progress towards a green economy. And in particular, they note, the HSBC Global Research notes that the expansion will be led by low carbon vehicles such as plug-in hybrids and full electric vehicles. China's growing clean energy market, which was the focus of their stimulus package, and the need for upfront capital for the new green technologies as they start to proliferate through the world. But for a lot of reasons, which I won't go into here in this talk, but which I've written about, you have to appreciate that relying on green stimulus alone is not enough to instigate a global green recovery or a transition to a green economy. For one, and something I'll talk a little bit later, there's a lot of complementary policies, or the lack of complementary policies, that hold back the long-term effect. For example, fossil fuel subsidies and other market distortions, as well as the lack of environmental pricing policies in general, including carbon markets and regulation. These will diminish the impact of any of these G20 green stimulants on long-run investments and job creation in green sectors. In addition, there's likely to be trade-offs in many of these stimulus packages between short-run and long-run, short-run objectives and long-run growth environment and employment impacts. And a study by the World Bank written by John Strand and Mike Tillman illustrates this with a number of programs, whether it's energy efficiency or other clean energy programs. You can see that they have variable impacts in terms of short-term stimulus effects versus more long-term growth, greenhouse gas reduction, and environmental improvement effects. So again, if you focus on the short-term aspects of these programs, you may sacrifice the long-term, and vice versa. And let's be clear, the main purpose of these packages was to find a series of policies to stimulate aggregate demand in the short run during the recession. So perhaps by doing so, particularly by the focus on energy efficiency, in particular in many of these green stimulus packages, you may not have quite the bang in terms of long-term transitions to more environmental or green economy. Okay. Now, that's my, in the nutshell, assessment of what actually has happened and the issue of progress. But I think there's a more fundamental problem and challenge here that's been neglected by the international community and policymakers. And I think it's this, that it's good to have rapid expansion of clean energy and energy efficiency markets. That's great. And that should be a boost to global green growth in some way. But it still does not guarantee that the world will attain sustainable development. Investments in clean energy, energy efficiency are good and may be necessary as part of a more sustainable or green economy, but they're not sufficient. And the reason is, what's neglected in this picture, if you go back to that UNEP definition, is the problem of ecological scarcity. Green growth in the form of green, more expansion of clean energy and energy efficiency does not mean sustainable growth, as long as global ecosystem degradation continues to be a major problem and one generating ecological scarcity. And in fact, in order to deal with the problem of ecological scarcity, we have to face two challenges: a sustainability challenge, which ecological scarcity presents to us, and the funding challenge, which is how do we deal with and overcome global problems of ecological degradation. Okay, why is ecological scarcity a sustainability challenge? Well, what we want is economic development. And the reason is that economic development generates a lot of benefits, including our goals of income growth, employment, poverty alleviation. But what should be clear to everyone in this room, given your studies here, is that we have yet to find a way in which economic development eliminates completely resource depletion and pollution. The result is we're going to end up with altered ecosystems, and if we develop in certain ways and we lead to more resource depletion, more pollution, more altered ecosystems, we're going to end up with more ecological scarcity. And the problem is that so far we have not convinced global policymakers that economic development must take into account the worsening ecological scarcity that it causes, and that this problem is central to the sustainability challenge facing the world today. And I'm going to elaborate on this. I'll come back to this in a minute. The second challenge I mentioned is the funding challenge. Basically, right now, the world faces a huge gap between the global benefits that we receive from ecosystems and what we're willing to pay to maintain and conserve them. As a rough estimate, it's likely that the global benefits of ecosystems, goods and services, are likely to be in hundreds of billions of dollars. Yet at most, the world spends about $10 billion annually on an ecosystem conservation. That's a huge gap. And one area that this is reflected is in just simple protection, which is not the only aspect of ecosystem conservation. But in terms of the number of protected areas in the world, yes, they continue to grow, but they are seriously underfunded, both globally and especially in the areas, in the regions of the world where the areas of critical diverse habitats, ecosystems, and species exist, such as Africa, Latin America, North Africa, and Middle East and Asia in general. So, financing and implementing international mechanisms to combat this global funding problem is a critical challenge facing the world today, and the second part of the transition to a green economy. All right. I'm now wanting to give a little bit of context to the sustainability challenge by talking about sustainable economic development. There's a long history in the discussion of sustainable economic development. I'm not quite sure how much of this has been discussed in your classes, so bear with me if this is all old hat to you. But this is a perspective that I find helpful to think about sustainable development, and one I helped to contribute to in some of my work previously. Generally, and from a standpoint of global policy making, it's been generally accepted that sustainable development, the concept starts with the World Commission on Environment Development, which defined sustainable development in 1987 as development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, this definition, since it was formulated by the World Commission, has resonated with economists because essentially what it tells us is that future generations should be entitled to at least the same level of economic opportunities and thus the same level of welfare as currently available to present generations. So that's a nice, easy economic goal and target. In other words, economic development today must ensure that future generations are left no worse off than present generations. Or in simple economic terms, per capita welfare should not be declining over time. That in turn helps us think about how do we provide these economic opportunities. And that in an economic sense means as long as the total capital stock of the economy, including its natural capital, which determines the full range of economic opportunities, is available to both present and future generations, then we should be able to attain sustainable development. So if sustainability is a goal, what it means is that society must decide how best to use its total capital stock today to increase current economic activities and welfare, and how much it needs to save or even accumulate for tomorrow, and ultimately for the well-being of future generations. So already we have got targets and concepts, and it's important to remember that sustainability is not the same thing as economic efficiency. Economic efficiency, as conventionally defined by economists, is important and necessary condition for sustainability, but it's not sufficient. It's a separate goal. To understand that, recall that from your basic economics training, that when we talk about economic efficiency, we're talking about maximizing the present value of net benefits resulting from the use of resources today and in the future. That's an important economic goal, economic efficiency. But when we talk about sustainability, we're talking about something a little bit different. An economy is sustainable when it's on a time path where future generations have economic opportunities at least as large as available to present generations. That depends on time paths of natural resource, capital endowments, and technological progress. We can't attain a sustainable time path without having accompanying paths that attain that goal in terms of our capital stock. The result is that many paths, future paths for our economy, may be efficient, but not all may be sustainable. All right, now how does this translate into thinking about the capital needed for our economy? Well, again, let's review how we view capital in the economy. In economics and in our systems of national accounts for our economy, we generally define capital rather narrowly. It's conventionally defined as reproducible real assets, or physical capital, which includes roads, railways, buildings, private dwellings, factories, and so forth, and other human manufactured fixed assets, or physical capital. But it's very clear to us now that the economy doesn't just depend on reproducible capital, as conventionally defined, but also human and natural capital. In the last 20 or 30 years, in particular, advances in endogenous growth theory in economics and in empirical growth work has put emphasis on human capital. That is, the education, skills, and health of the workforce and the general population of an economy is an important source of wealth. And I am delighted to say that natural resource economists have contributed as well by identifying natural capital. The economy's endowment of natural resources, such as fossil fuels, minerals, arable and grazing land, as well as its productive biological resources, timber, fish, wild resources, and so forth. Perhaps the newest contribution is to include or expand this concept of natural capital to include ecosystems. Why would we treat ecosystems as capital? Well, because just like any other asset in the economy, they yield a flow of valuable services that sustain and support economic activity. Or as Partha Dasgupta has said, they are similar to reproducible capital, and they also can depreciate if misused or overused, but they are also different. There's problems of irreversibility with natural capital such as ecosystems, or they at least take a long time to recover. And it's not easy to replace them once they get degraded. And finally, there's problems of collapse. So ecosystems should be treated as a form of natural capital. They're clearly another asset of the economy, but they're also very different. Now, what does all this mean for sustainable development? Well, let's summarize it in this diagram here. So sustainable development, as defined by the World Commission, is development that meets the needs of the present while not compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. As I've pointed out, in economics, that's a very simple concept. It means welfare does not decline over time, and that in turn requires managing a portfolio of assets for the economy, which doesn't include just reproducible or fixed capital, but also human capital and now natural capital, which also includes ecosystems as capital. That should be straightforward, right? Well, at this point, I think economists kind of diverge. Managing the stock of capital as a portfolio is fine, but we should ask ourselves, are some of this capital stocks, is some of it replaceable by other forms of capital or not? Well, one camp of thinkers on this who have been identified, I didn't choose these terms, but they've been identified as weak sustainability thinkers, argue that it doesn't matter what goes into our portfolio of capital assets. It could be less natural capital, more human capital, and reproducible capital. The point is that the whole portfolio increases in value. Imagine you are an investor and you have a portfolio of stocks in the stock market. It doesn't matter if stock A declines as long as stocks B and C rise in value to compensate for the decline in value of stock A. Your whole portfolio value is increasing over time. So you're handing off to your children a wealthier stock of assets, which will give them more wealth for the future. Well, that's the weak sustainability argument in a nutshell. As long as we can replace the capital that we deplete, of whatever form it is, with other forms of valuable capital, so the whole value of the portfolio stock is increasing, then we're going to make the future better off. However, the strong sustainability argument suggests the problem is that not all forms of capital in our portfolio for our economy are equally substitutable for each other. In particular, some forms of natural capital should be kept intact because we have not found a way of substituting for them if we lose or destroy them. Once we lose those natural capital, it's irreversible, and in any case, we don't really know the value of them. We've never known the value, and we still don't know the value, and we probably will never guess the future value of them. So the argument goes is that we can call that form of natural capital as essential natural capital, and we should keep it intact, or as much as possible. Just in a nutshell, the weak versus strong sustainability argument. The weak sustainability argument is there's no difference between natural and other forms of capital. And as long as depleted natural capital is replaced with even more valuable physical and human capital, then the value of our overall portfolio is going to increase. And what we need to do to attain sustainability is to maintain and enhance the value of the aggregate stock, the whole portfolio. Strong sustainability says we can't view the whole portfolio as a homogeneous stock. In fact, we can't always substitute for natural capital, as uncertainty over current and future values, particularly of ecological goods and services, unique environments, and biodiversity, mean that some natural capital is always going to be essential and cannot be replaced. So sustainability requires maintaining and enhancing the value of the aggregate capital stock. That's true, but it will also require preserving some essential natural capital. Now, I can go back to ecological scarcity. What this means is that ecological scarcity is going to be the key indicator. First of all, I think it's clear, and certainly from the quotes I showed you earlier by Partha Dasgupta and others, that the type of natural capital that most likely qualify as essential capital is ecosystems. And it's the one that's particularly at risk. And there's no argument about this. All the evidence agrees this. But what does it mean when we have rising ecological scarcity? Well, it means that we are depleting irrevocably ecosystems, and we're doing this rapidly. So the consequence is that current and future generations are going to be affected. Our record on this is not very good. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, published in 2005, pointed out that over the past 50 years, ecosystems have been modified more extensively than in any considerable period in human history, to the extent that over 60% of global ecosystem services have been degraded or used unsustainably. And of course, the projections for biodiversity are even worse. We're expecting biodiversity loss to increase rapidly over the next 50 years, and serious crises with many species. Now, I think it's helpful. This is a table which I included in my paper. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and you can see that in the middle column, the type of ecosystem services globally that are under threat are some very important services. Everything from key biomass and even biological resources to freshwater supplies, to increased vulnerability to pests and to storms and damages. So the services that we're losing are incredibly important to human welfare and will increasingly be so over time. Okay, so I just want to summarize so far. So yes, we've made some progress in the last few years towards a green economy, particularly in terms of jump-starting energy efficiency, clean energy. We can argue as to how big those changes are and how significant they are, but we should at least recognize we've made a start in those areas, at least compared to 5, 10 years ago. But it's also clear that what's been left out of the picture is this problem of ecological degradation, which is not getting better, it's getting worse. And it's clearly, as I've pointed out, a key indicator of the unsustainability of our current development efforts. So basically what we have is a pattern of economic development, not just in one country or a handful of countries, but globally, that's in this vicious cycle. And the starting point is increasing ecological scarcity, and the reason we have it is that environmental values, the values of these services and goods that we're losing, aren't reflected in current markets or prices or policies. And that in turn means we're going to continue pursuing a path of development with excessive environmental degradation. And as I pointed out in my first figure, that's going to mean altered ecosystems and increasing ecological scarcity. And as long as that scarcity isn't appearing anywhere, we're not accounting for it anywhere, the vicious cycle continues, and we're on this path of unsustainability as defined in terms of compromising the ability of future generations to meet their opportunities. So we're going to end up with loss of welfare over time. How do we deal with it? Well, we have to make some interventions. And the interventions are, first of all, using valuation and policy analysis to make explicit what we're not accounting for, which is the loss of values from environmental degradation. Second, we need to have what I call the 5 I's. Based on the analysis and the values that we estimate and the environmental degradation that occurs, we need better information, better incentives, institutions, investment, and infrastructure to deal with the excessive environmental degradation. And then finally, more ecological and economic analysis. That's in a nutshell what we need in terms of cooperation between natural scientists, economists, and other social sciences to continue to analyze the economic and income and distributional impacts of rising ecological scarcity. Why isn't this taking place? You know, if it's so straightforward, and if many of us have been talking about this for 20, 30 years, why aren't we seeing more efforts to deal with this? Well, there has been some progress. But the reason why I think ecological scarcity has been left out of the equation so far has to do with transaction costs. And in economics, transaction costs are costs other than market price that are incurred in existing production and market relationships. So what happens is that in order to change our existing market and production relationships to something else through a policy intervention, we will incur increasing transaction costs. So for example, imagine we have a market transaction which has a subsidy in it that's environmentally damaging, or it's a market transaction that imposes an environmental cost, it's an externality, and we want to impose a policy change. Well, there's a transaction cost, even if the market exists, by actually putting in these changes, and that's area A. If we want to go further and deal with an underlying market imperfection, such as the lack of property rights or open access problems, then we have to develop market enabling institutions, legal frameworks, perhaps new institutions, and so forth, that enable the market system to work effectively, to overcome the market failure that underlines the problem. That is area B, a bigger transaction cost. And then finally, if we need to go a step further and do something completely different, such as set up global trading or payments for ecosystem services that have never been set up before, we have to set up treaties, international environments, institutional arrangements, and legal systems as well. And that's an even bigger transaction cost, which is area C. And unfortunately, you can pick your favorite environmental problem, and you'll have at least one of these transaction costs, area A, and probably all three. And the bigger the problem, in terms of scale, geographical scale, whether it's particularly a global problem as opposed to a local problem, the bigger the transaction costs. So transaction cost is a huge aspect of the problem. And just very briefly, one example I give in my paper about the transaction costs that you're likely to see is the example of water markets and trading. One of the most important things, services, ecosystem services, is the availability of fresh water. And water is essential to a whole range of economic activities as well as human livelihoods and health. Yet it's probably one of the most inefficiently managed resources in the world. It's clear that water markets and trading could be part of the solution to a lot of water misallocation problems. But as I list here, there are huge transaction costs encountered for doing that. And overcoming these transaction costs are clearly non-price, non-market additional costs that are required and are necessary to overcome in order to establish these. So these transaction costs, and there's a huge literature in economics of water that details these types of transaction costs are one major reason why we don't see more water markets and trading, even though it would lead to more efficient allocation of water supplies. Another reason why we do not see much progress of improving environmental policy has to do with what I call either political costs or vested interests. And an example here is perverse subsidies. So as you well know, many ordinary markets in agriculture, energy, water, and so forth, there are a lot of subsidies to producers and to consumers. And these subsidies artificially lowers the cost of production. So for example, imagine you have a market for energy and you have a subsidy for energy production, and the result is that the cost of supply in energy goes from S, the supply curve S, to supply curve S0, S prime. The result is an increase in the quantity of energy supplied, but as shown in the bottom diagram, there's also an increase in marginal environmental damage. Now, if we remove the subsidy, it looks like a win-win. Subsidies are both inefficient and environmentally damaging in certain markets. In the case of energy, the fossil fuel energy, they are. We know that. So if we remove the subsidy, the supply curve shifts back from S bar to S. Environmental damage is reduced, so area D is gained in terms of environmental gain. There is also an efficiency gain because you've removed an inefficient pricing policy, which is a subsidy. And so there's an overall gain in efficiency of C. Win-win. In environmental economics textbooks, that's a win-win. Sounds good, but here's the problem. Somebody loses. And who loses is the producer. And the producer surplus loss, as you can see in this diagram, is area A plus B. So the political cost of removing environmental subsidy is area A plus B over area C plus D. And it doesn't matter how big this relative ratio will be. Obviously, the bigger it is, the more the political cost is. But here's the thing. If a sufficiently large enough entity loses out on the political cost, they're going to make darn sure that the removal of the subsidy will not take place. Despite the gains overall to society, the political cost of subsidy is worth doing something about. The political cost of subsidy removal is worth doing something about, and the vested interests will fight it. Same thing with an environmental tax. We know that to internalize an externality, an environmental tax can be a very worthwhile objective. Now, obviously, if you impose environmental tax, you're going to raise the cost of supply, in this case from S to S prime, by the amount of the tax. There will be an efficiency loss. The efficiency loss is area C plus D, because you are, of course, intervening in a market, causing an efficiency loss. But you will also gain in terms of reducing the environmental impact, the externality. So imagine you impose a carbon tax on a competitive energy market, fossil fuel market. The carbon tax will cause some efficiency loss, area C plus D, but it will also reduce carbon or greenhouse gas damages by area E. So we could make the case if the loss in efficiency is more than compensated by the gains in reducing environmental damages, society is better off, which is why a lot of economists like using taxes or recommend using taxes as a way of internalizing extremely large and damaging environmental costs, such as externalities. But keep in mind, the tax has another impact, which is it's going to, again, increase producer losses. And the producer loss is going to be, in this case, A plus B plus C. So the real political cost is that area, A plus B plus C, over the net gain in, from reducing environmental externalities. Hence, there's a huge political vested interest in going against imposing environmental damages as well. Okay. How significant is this problem? Well, we know that subsidies are a huge problem. You take 4 areas, major markets for goods and services in the world, water, energy, agriculture, and transport, and you can see that globally, the subsidies in these markets can be as close to $1 trillion based on available estimates. Now recall what I said about the global stimulus. The global stimulus packages were about half that. So if we just cut global subsidies by 1/2, we could have financed the entire green stimulus packages that I mentioned that occurred. But no, what we've done is we've kept the subsidies going globally, and we've added in additional costs on governments of funding green stimulus out of expenditures instead. Another thing to keep in perspective, global GDP is about $25 trillion. So this amount is anywhere from about 3 to 5% of global GDP. And finally, remember what I said, ecosystem conservation, $10 billion. $1,000 billion versus $10 billion on ecosystem conservation, $1,000 billion, $1 trillion on subsidies. So I think the vested argument, political is valid. Also, those figures I showed you are from a range of averages over the last 5 to 10 years. Subsidies appear to be worsening, not lessening. The vested interests in those markets are asking for more, not less. And it's very clear in energy subsidies. A major report by the International Energy Agency, OPEC even, OECD and the World Bank for the Pittsburgh G20 summit at the height of the recession estimated that fossil fuel consumption's subsidies globally amounted to $557 billion. Production subsidies amounted for another $100 billion. And these together account for 1% of world GDP in 2008. Remember, green stimulus amounted to only 0.7% of GDP on average, global GDP. That's just energy, not agricultural, water, and transport. That's just energy. And just for fossil fuel production consumption. It doesn't even include nuclear subsidies. Not only this report went further and showed that phasing out these subsidies by 2020 could result in a 5.8% reduction in global primary energy demand and a 7% fall in greenhouse gas emissions. Yet still no progress has been made. All right, global funding for biodiversity and ecosystems. I mentioned this before about the wide gap. And I think that this gap between funding global conservation and the benefits we get really is a reflection of how far we are from taking sustainability seriously. And there's two aspects to this funding challenge. First, there's the need to design adequate global mechanisms that provide compensation for ecosystem services that have global benefits but are conserved locally or nationally. And secondly, we got to raise and provide adequate financing of these mechanisms. As I list in the paper, the list of mechanisms we have available to us potentially and actually are pretty interesting, pretty significant. They range from what we already have, which is the Global Environmental Facility, which since 1991, over the last 20 years, to its credit, has raised over $9 billion for global biodiversity conservation. Not bad, $9 billion. Still a paltry sum. International payment for ecosystem services. Well, there's a lot of talk. There is movement in funding for RED Plus. I always get it wrong. Reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation. But the amount of money raised and promised so far is in the low millions to small billions of dollars, not in the hundreds of billions. And that leads us to other mechanisms. Well, I've already talked about the problems of raising money through taxes, and you could apply the same arguments to tradable permits, even harder to instigate because of the transaction costs. And to date, the progress on setting up any kind of global carbon tax or global tradable permit system has not been very encouraging. And that leaves us with a handful of things that have been bandied about, such as financial transaction tax or currency transaction taxes, or international finance facilities, such as the one that's been set up for immunization and health, And then stuff that's been around for years as far as I can remember, such as taxes on airline travel and arms trade. If you ever done a frequent flyer trip to internationally, use your frequent flyer miles to go international, you'll find out that you actually save maybe about a third of your ticket because you still have to pay the taxes. So travel taxes on airline are already about 2/3 of the cost of an international ticket. I'm not sure how much it can bear. And in terms of taxes on the global arms trade, good luck. All right, my final remarks is this. I've got nothing against fostering clean energy and energy efficiency. I think it's necessary, it's essential, and it's an important step. But it's unlikely to be sufficient if you're really interested in a transition to a green economy. Hard though it's been, and despite the political backlash we are getting in many places, including this country, it is not sufficient. Anybody who tells you it is, they're not speaking the truth. Unless we deal with ecological scarcity full on, and it's a global problem that has a sustainability challenge and a funding challenge, then we're putting the welfare of future generations and even this current one at risk. I've got 4 kids. They range in age from 5 to 25. I would like to think that they would have a better future to me. I'm not even sure I'm going to have a good future, provided I live that long, because of the rate at which this problem is getting worse and accelerating. If global policymakers are truly willing to break the vicious cycle of unsustainable development, then we've got to address the current global shortfall in ecosystem conservation. I think many countries could raise the money through their own national means, particularly the more rich and rapidly developing and industrializing countries. But there's many other countries of the world and many other regions within countries of the world which desperately need assistance. And we're talking about global benefits here. Benefits today and in the future. We have to deal with it. I think the potential biggest breakthrough and hope might be through a currency transaction tax or financial transaction tax. I talk about that in my paper. And I actually think, perversely, the time to do it is now, because as Stephanie Griffith-Jones argued, improving the net contribution of the financial sector to the real economy and to the welfare of ordinary people would significantly rehabilitate the financial sector's battered image, which should be a desirable aim of that sector itself. So I think there is some hope there. I don't hold up much hope for those other global funding mechanisms. I have some hope there. It's a modest hope, but hopefully we'll go from there. Thanks very much.